Hi, and welcome to this week's Bible study preview as we are just about finished with the book of Isaiah. There are some difficult things to hear in this section for sure, as there have been really throughout our study of Isaiah. God had told the prophet this would be a difficult message to proclaim to the people. But our section for today, it's a big section, 7 chapters, is primarily positive, as God promises some pictures of rebuilding. What will happen to the people of Israel once they come back from exile, and especially what's going to happen to them in the New Testament era, including today. The Christian church in 2022. The picture you have here on the screen is from Isaiah chapter 60. The idea that people are drawn to Jesus here will make this picture a little larger so you can see it a little bit better. You have two people gathered beneath the cross in the empty tomb. I like how the artist portrayed this here. The cross works its way into the stone being rolled away from the tomb, and you can see in the background there are people who are supposed to be dead, and they come to the cross and empty tomb, and they're made alive. So there's great hope in this section from Isaiah. We're going to start by having you watch a short clip that I will insert into the video here. So it's only about a couple minutes long. Check it out now.
In the U.S., we only have to go back to 1814, when British troops burned down the White House and nearly all of Washington, D.C. One person at the scene of the fire wrote, "The metropolis of our country was abandoned to its horrid fate." More than 200 years later, we spoke to historian Matthew Costello about the damage.
And the damage was pretty significant to the White House. The south side of the White House was probably in the best condition, but based on the records, the north side experienced the most structural damage, and then also the east and west walls. So portions of those walls had to be rebuilt and replaced after the war.
Government workers and White House servants were able to save artifacts like the Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution, and a painting of George Washington. But otherwise, most things inside the building were damaged beyond repair. Politicians debated moving the Capitol somewhere else instead of rebuilding the White House and the city. But then President James Madison and his supporters pushed to keep the Capitol in D.C. And 3 years later, in 1817, the White House was rebuilt.
It's one of those buildings that I think everyone immediately recognizes. They know that that's where the president and the first family live, and it's a representation of who we are as Americans and how we define ourselves. So in many regards, that house represents a part of all of us. It's the people's house. And over time, I think it's one of those things that there's an enduring power to that idea that we all have a share or a claim in that house, in its history and its occupants.
The cost of rebuilding the White House was estimated at more than $300,000, almost $5 million today. That number is significant but small compared to the rebuilding costs of Windsor Castle or Rio de Janeiro's National Museum, $47 and $12 million respectively. Officials are still calculating the costs of rebuilding the Notre Dame Cathedral of Paris, but estimations are already in the billions of dollars.
The American people are not that much different from the French people in that we've vested a lot of history in our traditions and in our buildings. And with the White House, it was very important to President Madison that this tragedy had occurred, but that the United States was going to be a country that rebuilds, not relocates. And it was that kind of grit and determination that I think really defined the American character. And
Watch that clip, you think about how tough that would have been for a very new country in the U.S. to lose the White House and the war there, and the great efforts it took to rebuild it. And people's feeling that we're not going to move it, we're not going to move the location of it, we're not going to move the capital from the city, but we're going to rebuild right here because this is important to our identity as Americans. So the rebuilding, and it touched on a couple other landmarks in the video, Notre Dame Cathedral, and there's a terrible fire there a couple of years ago, which is when this video was made, and the great efforts to rebuild it are still going on today. That concept of rebuilding and the emotions associated with it are really the heart of our lesson that we'll talk about on Thursday evening. Lesson objectives: 1, explain how God's promise extended beyond Israel. That's the first activity we'll talk about. This promise wasn't just for God's people in Israel, the Jewish people. It was for more than them, which is good for us. And then list at least 3 pictures of Israel's restoration. The last couple sections we'll look at in our study are just bam, bam, bam. Really, really good things happening. It's God's promise. So we're not going to get too much into the details in this video. We'll just do an overview of those 7 chapters. So in chapter 56, Isaiah 56, if you're looking at the sheet, the title there is Salvation Expands. And as you read through those couple verses there, you see that God is talking about this promise of salvation for those who trust in Him wouldn't just be for Israel, but it would be people whose lives and whose behavior clearly demonstrated they were not Jewish people. They had done things that a Jewish person, if they were following God's command, would never ever do. So we're going to talk about in our study why this would have been striking for a Jewish person to read this. That God's plan of salvation wasn't just for them, His special people that He'd kind of built a hedge around, but it was for all people of all time. In the next section, Accusations against the Wicked, I said at the beginning of this video, there are some hard sections here, and this is one of them. The accusations against the wicked, the second half of chapter 56, really at first is directed to Israel's shepherds. And this is not the first time in the book of Isaiah that God had taken down their spiritual leaders, saying, you had a job to do. I have called you to be watchmen for the people, to warn them of spiritual danger and to direct them where they were to go to find safety, namely, go to the true God of Israel, find comfort in His mercy and grace and forgiveness from sins. Instead, they had gone to lots of other false gods. So we're going to talk about in the section what went so wrong with those watchmen of Israel. I'm on the second page of the study now, Isaiah 57. I think this is an important section for us to look through. It's all important. But the activity number 3, this is maybe the 3rd or 4th time I've done an activity like this in our study of Isaiah. It says, use the section to respond to someone who claims that God was too harsh in dealing with Old Testament Israel. I think that is a really common accusation against the God of the Bible, is that He is so cruel and He's so harsh. So why would you ever be drawn to Him? Why would you ever believe in Him? Or if someone believes in the New Testament God, they don't like Old Testament God and they feel they're completely different. And I think this section goes a long way toward explaining why does God speak so strongly to Israel? Why does He send them away to exile? And part of what he accuses them of here is worship of the god Molech. It's pretty dark. The worship of the god Molech involved a lot of child sacrifice. So that it's indefensible. And not a lot of what Israel does can be defended very well, but this is one. Nobody would argue that this was somehow right. The people of Israel had fallen into false religions that really involved adultery and child sacrifice. So is God being too harsh with people when they drifted away from Him and chased after gods who promoted sex and the murder of children? That feels like a pretty easy call for God to say, no, you people need a wake-up call. You have gone so far off the deep end in terms of your evil and your relationship with me. I don't know what to do with you except allow some pretty awful things to happen to you to draw you back to me, to wake me up. So is God being unfair? Or as we talked about 2 weeks ago, is God being a lot more patient than you and I would ever dream of being with someone who treated us the way Israel treated Him? The next section, comfort for the contrite. So now we get back into the good stuff. So that very same chapter in which God has decried Israel for their worship of Molech, 10 verses later, He's talking about if you come back to me and demonstrate repentance, I'm more than ready to forgive. I've already forgiven you. So what we'll talk about here in activity number 4 is the explicit law and gospel in this section. It's so clear in this section. Explicit law and gospel. Look for that as you look through Isaiah 57, 15 and 19. Next section, Isaiah 58, 1-5. What are we looking at here? God is talking about some hypocritical behavior from the people, that they were wondering why God wouldn't answer them and wouldn't come to rescue them. And He's saying, well, you're acting like a nation who had really been listening to me and following me. It's like, that's a question an obedient nation would ask. Why hasn't God listened to me? Why haven't I listened to you? Your hearts have been far from me. That's why I haven't listened to you. So that could be an interesting activity for you to think through. The next section, Isaiah 59, 1-11. This is probably the roughest of the sections, I would say, as God lays out their sin and exactly how bad it was. And the activity there for you in number 6 is just to count the number of pictures God uses for sin. And they're striking. One of them I'll give you, Isaiah 59:2, that sin separates us from God, which is really the worst thing that sin does. It's offensive to God, but the fact that it separates us from a God who loves us is the very worst thing about sin. And then a lot of other creepy pictures. I'm not afraid of snakes or spiders, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I am. I guess I don't encounter snakes a lot. I don't encounter spiders like this a lot. I don't feel that scared of them. Who knows? Maybe if I saw one of these guys in real life, I'd be freaked out. But they are creepy. I do find these pictures creepy for sure. So there's an extended section in here where God talks about sin being like hatching the eggs of vipers and spinning a spider's web, and then you try to cover over your sin with a spider's web, and you think of how that's a great image, because how ludicrous would it be to try to keep warm or cover yourself with a spider's web? It's so thin and so fragile, it just tears apart, not to mention that it's not, you can see right through it. The next section, from here on out, it gets really good. The end of Isaiah 59, chapter 60, 61, 62. Now is where we really get into the pictures of restoration and rebuilding that we talked about at the beginning of this, in the introduction to this lesson. So end of 59, he talks about people coming to fear the name from the Lord from all over the earth. Chapter 60, the glory of Zion. Some of these verses are going to sound very familiar to you because they're part of our readings in church. In Isaiah 60, those first 5 verses there, the activity is to just figure out why would those verses be a reading for the festival of Epiphany in our church. Isaiah 61, the year of the Lord's favor. The Spirit of the Lord, Sovereign Lord, is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. Those are Jesus' words. So here we have that servant talking. And the task for you, number 9, when did Jesus quote this section, literally? There was a point where Jesus quoted these words and people had a very strong reaction to him. So talk through where that was and what the reaction was. The concept of an oak of righteousness, applying that to our life, that's there. Then let's get the snake and spider off the screen. It finishes with Isaiah 62. God gives us a new name, and we're going to try to finish with that, give ourselves plenty of time to talk about that new name that God... they went from being called deserted to a name that means the Lord will delight in you. So, cyclical. The people had had a good relationship with God. It was blasted apart by sin. They were deserted because of their sin. But God says, I'm going to give you a new name. The Lord delights in you. So literally, Israel's name was going to remind them that God found delight in them. Wonder of wonders, God's grace was there for them. Okay, big section. If you're watching this, I hope you get a chance to read all those verses ahead of time, break it up over a few days, because 7 chapters of Isaiah is quite a bit to read in one sitting. And I hope that you found this video helpful. I hope that you get a chance to join us for the study. All right, God bless.